Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. A little bit different. We are doing an office hours today, so slightly different from our usual regularly programmed webinar series. Rationale here is simply that at the higher level of Charging Smart, there still are some of those complications that are reducing the amount of TA we're able to provide in some locations. So our thought is we could intermingle some of these office hours into our webinar programming, just as another opportunity for a touch point with communities and to be able to provide TA in a way that maybe is not easily accessible through the larger Charging Smart program. So excited to have folks with us today. We also do want to cover a couple of updates. We are very lucky today to have my colleague Moaz Uddin here with us, who is going to be discussing some updates or proposed updates to some policy that may affect EV charger deployment. So, really fortunate to have Moaz on with us from our transportation and fuels team. After that, do want to touch on a couple of just highlights of EVs in the news, recognizing that there's a lot going on in the world, so people probably don't have the time to keep up to date on all of the different nuances in the electrification realm. So, wanting to just pull some highlights for folks today. And then after that, we will be opening the floor to Q&A and office hours. That will continue through the duration of this hour. If folks want to stick around for that, feel free. If not, can kind of pop in and out, whatever works. But just wanting to lay that out now that once we have kind of covered some of these updates, pretty much floor will be yours, any attendees to ask any questions of us. So first, just a couple of quick program updates and housekeeping. Just a reminder, Charging Smart still active, including that designation component. So if folks are continuing to work through those criteria, please feel free to reach out to GPI. We will be able to connect you with IREC as they are starting to, especially right now, re-up some of their community designation efforts. So always excited to connect folks there. Also, just a reminder that all of the Charging Smart resources are still up and available free of charge to communities. We have links here to our Charging Smart homepage as well as the Charging Smart program guide. All of those resources still open and available, including GPI's YouTube webpage, which actually has recordings of all of these webinars up there, so easy access for folks. And as I mentioned, we are going to be intermingling some of these office hours in with our regularly programmed webinar series, partially dependent on demand. If it turns out folks aren't coming to these and asking a ton of questions, we may reconsider, but want to present this opportunity just to see if communities are interested in accessing this particular resource. With that, I do want to hand over the time to Moaz, who's going to be discussing a bit about the FHA's new proposed changes to some Buy America requirements that may impact EV charger deployment. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and hand the time over to Moaz.
Thanks so much, Jem and Zoe, for having me on. My name is Moaz Mia. I am also at the Great Plains Institute. I'm in the Transportation and Fuels team, and I facilitate Drive Electric Minnesota, which is a coalition of EV advocates in Minnesota. And some of you might even be members because we have local government, state agencies, charging providers, OEMs, nonprofits like us. So we're a band of EV advocates from Minnesota, and since I facilitate that group, I also have had to get up to speed on these proposed modifications to the waiver, because as a group we had to decide what our comments were going to be. So I'm going to share the little slide deck that I made last week as Drive Electric Minnesota was trying to understand these modifications, what concerns we have, and then drafting of a response. So right now you'll be just, I'll walk you through that process. And we are also working on final comments and happy to share that with Jem. And Jem, you can then pass that along with the group in case you are interested in making your own comments. So I'm going to share my screen and then just go through a little bit of the details on this waiver and what it means, or at least our understanding of it. So this waiver, it's it only applies. So Buy America has been around It basically applies to when the US government funds any program, and if you are going to be buying any manufactured components. So in this case, we're interested in EV chargers and whether or not they're exempt from Buy America, which if there was no exemption, the assumption would be that any EV chargers bought through FHWA funding should be fully sourced and manufactured in the US. So when the bipartisan infrastructure law passed in 2021, it's a few years ago now, the concern at that time was, okay, we have at least $7.5 billion in EV charging programs. If you look at NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and CFI, Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program, that's $7.5 billion. And there was a major concern that we will not be able to find domestically sourced chargers, and that's just going to stop this funding from really going anywhere. So the FHWA first released a request for information back in 2021 just to determine the state of domestic capacity for manufacturing chargers. And based on what they heard in that, and this was the end of 2021, November, based on what they heard from everyone like us, manufacturers all across the country, they in 2023 came out with what was the final EV charger waiver. And what they established then, this was, I think, February of 2023, they established like, okay, for about a year or so, we are not going to apply Buy America. So any ongoing projects can just import chargers, or they can have significant foreign components and be manufactured in the US. And then starting 2024, that was I think the July of 2024, there was a rule that said 55% of the cost of an EV charger, if you look at the components, must be sourced from the US, and then the charger itself has to be put together in the US. So if you hear someone say the 55% rule, that's what they mean. And it became applicable starting July 2024. But the rule came out in 2023. So people often refer to the 2023 rule that set the 55% threshold. So that's kind of the starting point here. And now I want to go into what's changing. So we have the status quo of 55% of the EV chargers components need to be sourced from the US, and we look at the cost when we say 55%, not weight or some other criteria. That had been the status quo. Last year, January of 2025, actually, the FHWA did something similar where they again, there was a previous RFI, and based on that, they came out with another final notice. So just almost exactly a year ago, where they kept the 55% rule. In fact, they expanded it beyond EV chargers. They said that any manufactured goods that are funded through FHWA dollars, 55% of the cost of those components should also be coming from the US. So, in a way, implicitly agreeing that the 55% rule still applies, we keep things the way they are. Then, come February this year, earlier this month, we suddenly hear another proposed modification, which means they came out with this proposed modification and gave everyone about a month where we can provide comments on this proposed modification. It's not a final notice yet. What previously, when I mentioned in 2023 and 2025, were final notices. This is a proposed modification that would lead to them coming out with a final notice after there's some comment period, which is what we're working on right now. So the proposed modification now coming to the meat of it is basically they have proposed increasing that threshold from 55% of the cost of EV charger materials and components to 100%, meaning nothing. in the EV charger can be sourced from abroad. No components imported. Everything starting from the steel to any chips, everything needs to be domestically sourced and then um, also manufactured in the US, which was also the case. It's been the status quo that the charger has to be put together in the US. So now we're just going from 55% to 100%, which we'll talk about our concerns about that on the next slide. But the process is right now, the comment period is open. We have until March 16th of this year. So it's about, say, roughly 20, 18 days. So individuals, organizations, and other entities can just make comments saying whether or not they agree with this or if they have any concerns. And that's what we're doing. So, Drive Electric Minnesota as a coalition, we met and we talked about what our concerns are with this increase to 100%. We talked to some charging manufacturers, and basically, we found out it's going to be very difficult. There are no charger manufacturers in the US who can 100% source their chargers in the US right now. So this could effectively mean we are not able to put any chargers in after that final notice comes out, which we don't know. It's probably going to be sometime this year. If the final notice comes out and it sticks to 100%, that's going to be a problem. So the way we gathered some priority statements, which we then have combined into a letter. And that is the letter I mentioned earlier in the call. I'm happy to share it with Jem so we can share it with this group. And if you are interested in making comments, I'll actually also share the link where you can add the comments. It's a very simple process. Um, yeah, so we kind of divided this into three buckets of concerns and then how we're responding to that. So the first one, I kind of alluded to this just a few moments ago, is the readiness of domestic manufacturing. We've talked to folks here in Minnesota and even outside the state, and it just seems like there isn't that capacity. There are some components, even if they're tiny, that will need to be imported. And there certainly isn't capacity if you look at just the scale at which we need to be putting chargers in and how the programs, the $7.5 billion programs I mentioned, NEVI and CFI, how they are scaling up. We think that the future demand is not going to be met from domestic, if you look at just the next few years from domestic manufacturing. So the risk here is supply chain bottlenecks, vendor concentration, which in the end just delays the deployment and increases the costs. So not great for deploying charging infrastructure. And our response, as you will see in the letter when it's shared, is that we recommend that the FHWA makes these decisions based on actual data on what's being manufactured, not just announcements about facilities and production lines, which has been the case. We have for the last few years, since 2021, when the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed and $7.5 billion was announced with all these caveats and all these strings. Manufacturers from all around the world started making announcements. They said, we are going to start manufacturing in the US by X date. That hasn't necessarily happened for all of the manufacturers. There certainly has been an increase in bringing some of that production to the US. We don't think it's at 100%. So that's what we are urging the FHWA to just be more transparent with where they're sourcing this data, if they have any, to suggest that we are at that point where we can manufacture domestically. Second concern is policy inconsistency. And here we make 2 points. One is I mentioned just 1 year ago, January of 2025, they came out with another final recommendation, final notice, where that 55% rule was kept and expanded to beyond just EV chargers for any funding, any manufactured goods funded by FHWA. So We are saying as of 1 year ago, you saw that there wasn't manufacturing capacity domestically. What has changed? And if anything has changed, the FHWA should point to that before we make a drastic change going from 55% to 100%. Another point that we also add in this policy inconsistency later on when we started developing the letter is that if you look at other goods, not looking at EV chargers, but let's say looking at when the FHWA funds buses or trucks or rolling stock, which includes like trains, um, we have seen Buy America requirements there too. They want most of the goods they fund to be manufactured in the US, which is a goal that Drive Electric Minnesota also supports. But they usually have a ramp up schedule, which is not what we're seeing with chargers here. We're going from 55% to just everything needs to be produced here. With these other rolling stock, it's usually a much more gradual increase to 100% if they even get to 100%. So we want some consistency here as well. EV chargers should be treated the same way as other manufactured items funded by FHWA. Third one is equity. And we're also reframing this as energy affordability, just because some words are bad words now, so we have to be careful. So this is another discussion we need to have, but the core of it is just equity because slower charger deployment, and this is we're looking at public chargers. So when the lack of public chargers, who does it affect? The people who do not have access to charging at home, which is usually people with single family homes, so and newer ones. So we are trying to make the point that there are rural communities where people are not able to make their commute without fast public charging. There are renters and multi-family housing residents who just do not have access to charging where they are. So they rely on fast charging. And by delaying putting this charging infrastructure in, we are delaying their potential purchase of EVs and a cheaper means of transportation. And those who already have made the leap and have EVs, we're just making it very inconvenient for them to continue fueling their vehicles. So we're also urging the FHWA to evaluate those impacts alongside the manufacturing goals, which we support, but just in a different, staggered way. So that those are the slides. Those are just the three buckets. I know I went through them kind of fast, but you can see our contact information on this slide. If you want to reach out, let's say you're developing your own comments. We are just finalizing our letter right now. What you saw is kind of the essence of that letter, but it's just language tweaks with our membership of Drive Electric Minnesota. We expect it to be done early next week, the week of March 2, and happy to share it then. In the meantime, if you have any questions, happy to answer them right now or reach out to us on these email addresses.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Moaz. And yeah, I'll just pause here, see if any folks have questions specifically for Moaz on this particular subject. And feel free to toss those in the chat as well if folks aren't able to come off mute. I did have just maybe a silly, but just wanted to clarify, Moaz. So this particular change, of course, is really just impacting how federal dollars are spent. So if we're talking the private deployment of charging infrastructure, this really has no impact on that. Is that correct?
That is correct, Jem, and that's a good question. So it doesn't have any direct impact. This change will not, it doesn't mean that now if I wanted to buy a charger privately, that I can only buy something that's 100% domestically sourced. No, for the private market, this does not apply. However, I mentioned one of our concerns was kind of supply chain bottlenecks that
Mm.
can affect um, other other organizations' private deployment of chargers because it might create this moment where domestic EV chargers and components just run out because everyone who is getting FHWA chargers is just trying to take those chargers because those are the only ones the funding can apply to. And suddenly we see kind of a toilet paper in the pandemic situation, but with domestic EV chargers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also have to imagine that equity component you mentioned. Like, if we're really only relying on private sector to deploy chargers, then I think that only exacerbates some equity issues if they're really only deploying where it's cost effective to do so, which would leave, I think, a lot of communities out to dry in terms of access to this sort of infrastructure.
Yes, that's a great point. Actually, we should add that to our letter as well, because private infrastructure is deployed where it's most profitable, as opposed to the FHWA money is often going to governments who are looking at where the need is. So, yeah, that's a good point.
Well, awesome. Well, if folks do think of additional questions, as Moaz mentioned, we'll have his contact information here included in our follow-up email as well. I will real quick take over screen share, if that's all right, Moaz.
Yes, screen's all yours.
And I know Moaz is going to include some of this as well, but also here in our slide deck, I also have that a link to the actual notice that came out, kind of explaining the proposed changes, as well as the submission instructions that are included in that notice. So again, Moaz maybe has a more direct way that he will be able to include, but also have access to that ability to submit comments if you feel so inclined to do so via this slide.
Yeah, I was going to share something exactly like that. So thank you. You already have it on your deck, Jim. That's awesome.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, thank you again, Moaz. If you'd like to stick around, of course, feel free. The next step things for today, just real quickly, again, wanting to touch on a little bit of fun information, just kind of keeping people appraised of what's going on in the wider world of EVs. So, liking to pull out a couple of high-level news headlines with EVs included. So, kicking off, recently JD Power put out a annual report that it has been doing since 2021, really looking at EV satisfaction, the satisfaction of EV owners. And the most recent report that did come out found that 96% of EV owners would very likely to consider an EV for their next vehicle. So this is confirming things that we've been hearing and seeing in our own work, but nice to see it put so succinctly that once people try out electric vehicles or transportation electrification, typically they aren't going backwards, going back to internal combustion vehicles. Just once you get through those initial barriers, we find, and as we can see in the data, satisfaction is quite high. Also, in that same report, there were findings that satisfaction levels of EV owners are at their highest levels since that study in 2021. I have included links to this study so folks can kind of dig in if they feel so inclined. And also, really high thing to note is that satisfaction with public charging infrastructure experienced the largest growth in terms of overall satisfaction scores in this year's report. So, just general trends showing that even as we're hearing maybe some reports about the new EV market slowing, we're also seeing this information coming out that people that are trying out and have adopted electrified transportation are typically sticking with that decision and not backtracking. Also included in that report, satisfaction scores out of 1,000 for both mass market EVs as well as premium EVs. They do get into a bit more detail on these satisfaction scores and how they're calculated, and then also comparing them against internal combustion vehicles and plug-in electric hybrid vehicles. Next big headline we'd like to highlight is 2026 being the year of the used EV. At least that's kind of what the data seems to be showing. A recent report from Cox Automotive showed that EV sales in January are up 20%, are predicted on up 20% compared to January of last year. Also seen that the average listing price of used EVs is down, and nearly a third of all used EVs are being listed for under $25,000. So we're really seeing the used EV market creep into that area where it's becoming increasingly cost competitive with internal combustion used vehicles. And we really expect this to kind of be exacerbated over this year and next as well, with what we're kind of calling the whiplash effect of the now dead EV tax credit. So, of course, folks will probably remember the EV tax credit at the federal level, providing incentives for folks to invest in either purchasing or leasing an EV. And of course, for policy nerds that were really tapped into this, folks might remember that really leasing became a very, very attractive deal under the terms of the federal EV tax credit. And from 2022 up until when that tax credit was canceled, we saw hundreds of thousands and over a million EVs leased that are now set to be returned. We expect that over 300,000 EVs will be returned from lease in 2026, which will be an increase of over 200% compared to 2025. And that number could reach 650,000 by 2027. So definitely anticipating that this combination of factors, seeing average prices going down, the increase of supply of used EVs, we definitely think that this could be another element to keep an eye on in terms of driving EV adoption. Less so about early adopters kind of testing out a new technology, and maybe more so driven simply by the fact that used EVs become too good of a deal to pass up in the used marketplace. And then our last headline that we wanted to touch on is the growth of Chinese EVs in North America. Now, folks might have seen recently that Canada struck a trade agreement with China that the headlines maybe misled a little bit. What it essentially did was replace the 100% tariff that Canada had on Chinese EVs with a 6.1% tariff, but only for 49,000 Chinese EVs. So there is a pretty small number of EVs that will actually be allowed under these favorable trade conditions. But this is quite a removal from the policy of 100% tariffs, which Canada shared with the United States up until recently, really trying to protect domestic auto manufacturing. But recent kind of political unrest, trade wins, different countries, especially Canada, has started to look to other trade partners to kind of fill some of the gaps that may be kind of growing as tensions are in place between our two nations. So seeing China kind of step in, and this is not the first foray into North America that Chinese EV companies have already kind of dove into. In Mexico already, 7 of 10 EVs are already produced specifically by BYD, a Chinese EV company. So Chinese EV companies already have a really strong foothold in North America, expecting that to increase with this incursion into the Canadian market as well. And as of right now, several Chinese firms are exploring opportunities to build EV manufacturing plants in North America, which does have some North American original equipment manufacturers worried. Ford specifically has commented on kind of this new development of Canada allowing Chinese EVs into the country with a bit of alarm. So, something we will be keeping an eye on moving forward. And definitely something that impacts the wider world of transportation electrification, if not so much that here in the United States.